Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloé Messdaghi, and I am the host of ITSP Magazine's Secure Your Strategy podcast. And with me today, I have a special guest named Simon. Simon, you want to tell the world a little bit about yourself?
Hey Chloé, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Simon Hodgkinson. I am the former Chief Information Security Officer for BP. And prior to that, I ran global infrastructure and operations for BP across 60 countries, 80 countries, 600 sites, 75,000 staff. So I've seen security from all aspects and also delivered operations into there. Since leaving BP at the end of 2020, I'm now a strategic advisor for several software companies. I've also done advisory work in the National Health Service for their digital organisation, and I've served as advisor for the Natural History Museum.
Well, I'm going to have to ask so many questions about the Natural History Museum because I'm now really fascinated about that. But let's first go into the thing you're really passionate about, which is operations resiliency. And this has been your passion for some time now, but in particular this year as well. I know you went to InfoSec Europe, and that was a topic that was definitely trending. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your passion behind it and the reason why operations resilience is such like a passion of yours?
Yeah, well, so we talk in security, we talk a lot about cybersecurity for the purpose of cybersecurity. And I often think we forget what we're here to do. And our jobs in cybersecurity is to enable the business to be successful, to deliver on their strategic outcomes. And that means that we need to think through the lens of, is the business operationally resilient rather than is it just secure from a cyber perspective? And to use my former employer, BP, as an example, BP weren't there to do cybersecurity. BP were there to get hydrocarbons out the ground. They were there to produce renewable energy, to deliver fuel into retail stations, to run ships and what have you. Cyber is there to enable the business to be successful with appropriate mitigations and controls in place. And therefore, I always think through the lens of, is the business operationally resilient from a cybersecurity perspective? As I smile, but there is no absolute security. No company can put a hand on heart and say this business is 100% secure, and you never will be. You have to assume compromise, and therefore you have to think through the lens of, are we resilient should something happen to us? And if you think about the definition of resilience, it's about being able to withstand or recover from an adverse event. And I think that really describes what we do in cyber really, really well. You put things in place to withstand something bad happening, but you've got to assume it will happen. And therefore, are you able to recover from that event in a time frame that meets your business resilience requirements?
I like your point about, companies and the whole, we're 100% secure. I remember that right when I joined InfoSec, I remember going to RSA conference and there was these boards we're 100% secure, you can't break us and this and everything like that. I'm like, I feel like you're just creating a challenge for yourself because everyone is not secure. You cannot have 100% secure. And that's the thing that I really resonate with what you were talking about. But the other thing that resonated was the whole situation where, you as yourself, as a former CISO, one of the things that was very crucial is making sure that operations would flow, and understanding that cybersecurity plays a massive role in that. You cannot have operations without cybersecurity. But did you ever run into situations, say with like your peers or executives or boards, when you're trying to let them know like, hey, this is actually a risk situation, I need you to listen to me? Because I feel like CISOs are always dealing with that, and they're always looking for advice of how do I build this bridge with people that don't understand security, may have apathy to security, but I understand that this company would not survive without security.
Absolutely. I mean, I was blessed to have an incredibly supportive and well-informed executive team and board at BP. They engaged with the whole conversation around cybersecurity very early on. But I think the skill is actually talking about the risk to the business. It's not talking about unpatched servers and what have you. You know, that's an input metric. But actually, when you're talking to the business leadership, you've got to be turning that into a narrative that they understand. You know, any business leader can't be expected to understand at the lowest level of granularity each of the risks they need to manage. And if you think about, say, a BP or a National Health Service or what have you, you know, there are very different risks that they're managing every day of the week. So for an oil and gas company, you know, we worry about safety because the oil and gas industry has traditionally killed people, you know, turn up to the office and don't go home at night. So that's the number one priority, is to make sure that the people are safe. And so when you start talking about things like operational security, the security of things like the rigs and the refineries, you need to be talking about that in context of the actual business risk that's running. And of course, a cybersecurity attack on operational technology in one of those areas could have a kinetic effect. It could cause an explosion, and therefore the risk could be a major accident risk, which could lead to fatalities or an environmental impact. And once you start to talk in business language about the risk, then you tend to get a better connection and a better conversation. Now, I am never one that's going to say cybersecurity risk has to be your number one priority. It doesn't. Cybersecurity risk needs to be considered amongst all the other risks that your business is managing. And then when you've got constrained dollars, you've got to figure out which risk is more important, that you proportionally respond with whatever resources you have to managing it. And I think for certainly post NotPetya and WannaCry, there was a lot of running around saying the sky's falling in, you know, the world of cybersecurity, everything's going to crash, and using militaristic language, and, you know, even the imagery that goes around cybersecurity, the deep, dark arts of cybersecurity was there to scare people. And I think that worked for a short while. Because people were genuinely scared. They heard about the impact of the shipping company Maersk and Merck and Reckitt Benckiser, all of those companies that had devastating impacts. And the NHS in the UK, you might imagine, it's an organisation everybody understands and loves. And therefore, when they saw a cyber attack that impacted the NHS, they had an emotional connection to it. And the response was, the sky's falling in. You've got to open checkbook, spend money. Now, I think through some brilliant work to inform boards and executive teams about this is just another business risk, people are now starting to properly question where they allocate that constrained resources, and whether they put that money into market credit risk or physical safety risk or cybersecurity risk should be a balanced conversation.
Did you start seeing kind of like a shift of people becoming more security forward, like during the pandemic because of the surge of breaches, or was that something that you started seeing prior to the pandemic?
So I think it depends on the organization, really. I think you saw the bigger organizations, the larger enterprises, that started the cybersecurity journey a decade or more ago, and things like Shamoon in what was that 2013, and Petya as 2017 and what have you, they just accelerated those security programs because it brought cybersecurity into the mainstream press. People really understood that actually a cybersecurity event could cause devastating impact to the supply chain. And it wasn't that the shipping company had been hit. It was actually the goods I need from the shipping company aren't turning up. So people were seeing a real impact of that. And I think that's when it really started to become mainstream, and investment started to accelerate. Then the regulators get involved, and the regulators start to say, you need to do something about cybersecurity. And a lot of the smaller companies then start their compliance journeys, not necessarily doing it for the right reasons all of the time, but doing it because the regulators have told them they've got to do something about cybersecurity. So I think, the pandemic, of course, working from home created some different risks for organizations, and again sort of depended on where you were in your security journey and where you were in your cloud journey as well, as to how mature your security posture was as you went to home working. But you'll find a lot of the bigger organizations were already fairly advanced on some of the more on the cloud technology, and therefore they built security for a world where people were really coming in from an internet facing perspective. That's not true of all of them, though. I mean, we were very lucky. We had already largely deployed that kind of that model where everybody was deemed to be internet, on the internet. We were exposing our applications through the internet. We had robust connections back into our on-premise environments that were already there, and it was just a scaling issue that we had to deal with, where many organizations had to start that journey, but they tended to be the smaller ones.
I had a question about operations resiliency when it came to when you worked at BP, for example. I would imagine in oil industry, there's a huge emphasis on risk and making sure you understand the dangers. And it feels like that's very much ingrained in such an industry. But then you go to the tech industry, and I don't know if sometimes it doesn't feel as if they're more risk forward in a sense, depending on what company, of course. But I'm curious about if you've learned a lot from the oil industry that you've taken over to a tech industry when it comes to operations resiliency.
So I think so, but I think in many respects, so let me describe in a few incidents about why it's important, and you can see similar situations analogous situations in tech. So some of the bigger incidents we had were cyber attacks when I was at BP, were cyber attacks that impacted supply chain. So although a supplier of ours, there was one particular case where it was a logistics supplier in ANZ, they got hit by ransomware, and they weren't able to supply product to our retail stores. And if you've got no product on your shelves to sell, you can't open the store, right? Your business is effectively down. So there was the wake-up call for us. There was really about actually that wasn't a cyber resilience conversation at all. It was a business resilience conversation. Did we have resilience in our logistics provider in the supply chain? Should that one of them not be able to fulfill their business objectives, that we had somebody else who could do it? And that really, I think people need to think through, not cyber attack just on us as an organization, but if we're there to sell product, if we're a retailer and we're there to sell product, if we can't get product into the store, we've got nothing to sell, and therefore our business doesn't exist. And that there's one example. Another example is, we got a few of our contractors, so people who came in to manage activity within a couple of our upstream, our exploration environments, and they got hit by ransomware. And our immediate response to that was to cut their access off, because they were coming into our environment, they were working in our environment, they were potentially bringing technology into the environment. We wanted to make sure there was never going to be any lateral lateral movement into our environment, whatever caused their malware attempt. So by terminating their access meant that they couldn't do their jobs. So that affected our ability to get hydrocarbons out of the ground. And that costs a lot of money when you stop drilling. That's a huge amount of money. But the business was supportive because they understood the risk of us not doing that. But I share those examples because they weren't cyber attacks on BP, but they have a massive impact on our business resilience, because we hadn't necessarily considered that in our whole operational resilience response. Now, you saw the impact of a few of the tech companies in this, from solar winds, etc. The blowback from those incidents is enormous. And the potential for an attack on a tech provider then to, compromise thousands of companies. And that was always a concern for us, because we used a lot of outsourcing providers. So we had to make sure that as best we possibly could, we did appropriate assurance to say that those outsourcing providers were appropriate, secure, and the way they connected into our environment was appropriately secured, so that they couldn't cause an issue within BP. But equally, if they had a cyber attack on a big outsourcing provider, we still needed our IT systems to run. So we needed to make sure that they had resilience built into their operational models, such that they could still fulfill their obligations to deliver IT services to us. Because if those IT services weren't working, our business wasn't running. And I hope that sort of it gives you a sense of
definitely on that. I think like one of the things I always think about is how many companies don't have incident response plans still to this day.
Yeah,
it sounds like, Simon, that you're one of those folks that, like, when you were a CISO, that's like one of the top things, making sure that there is a threat response, incident response plan, and that there's been practices and drills probably as well. What are some advice that you would have for CISOs that are trying to move forward to do all these incident response plans, but also are trying to juggle like the time that they have? Because, CISOs can be very busy and security teams are always busy, but sometimes we're always not able to be proactive when it comes to security. So what's some advice that you have for CISOs that are dealing with that?
One of the best things is crisis simulation exercises with the executive team. Because you come back to the point you made very early on in the discussion about the challenge of getting the executive and the business leadership on board with the cyber journey. The best way we found to do that was to immerse them in simulation exercises. And again, to give an example, I mean, we were fairly mature from a cybersecurity perspective, but let's put it in context. Whenever we talk to the executive and the team and the board, we would always say you have to assume compromise and judge us on our ability to find people in our network. That's when you're good, when you find them that's in there. So they were very, very aware, but actually we used crisis simulation exercises to raise awareness so that we actually made progress with our maturity journey. And I don't want this to come across that we were brilliant. There was plenty that needed to improve, right? So, but we did do some things well. And so in the space of operational technology, as you can imagine, if you think about safety, environmental, reputational risk being the top things we need to worry about in the company, Well, having a significant major accident in one of our upstream or downstream facilities would be catastrophic, as you saw within the Gulf of Mexico, of course, when a real physical event took place. But so it was really, first part of that journey was actually convincing the engineers that this could happen, and then taking it up to the executive team to get the resources to address the cyber risk in those facilities. And it's very different. It's very different from OT and IT. I mean, there's you're moving from technology refresh cycles of a few years to 3-4 years to 10, 12, 15 years in the OT space. But nonetheless, you have to worry then about things like mitigating control. So we had a pretty simple but robust set of controls that we wanted to put in place, and we were making reasonable progress. But we use the crisis simulation exercise to continually educate people on what could happen should a piece of malware get into those environments, and also then almost guide the executive team to ask you the questions that you really wanted them to ask. So one of the examples would be we did a pretty reasonable job of inventory in the environment, but it was very manual, and it was down to the sites to inventory that, and it was often stored on Excel files, etc. And one of the scenarios we had was a PLC that was infected with malware, and the obvious question was, where else is it? And by the way, this was all simulation, so just for the avoidance of anybody listening into the call. But the obvious question was, where else is it in the environment? And the answer was, well, we'll need to go and phone around all of the different sites and ask them for their inventory. And then, well, why haven't we got a centralized configuration management system? Well, what a great idea that is. So then we started to invest in creating a central configuration management system for the OT environment. So you can use those crisis simulations and direct it at areas that you're not necessarily making the traction that you want. These are really bright people running these companies, really, really bright people running any business. And if you shape the crisis simulation in the right way so that people ask the obvious and sensible questions, and you're bold enough to say, well, we don't do that at the moment, or we don't do a great job of that, then that's the way you start to open up that narrative with the executive team and say, well, actually, maybe we should do that. Again, balancing every other priority and risk that they've got to manage. That's one other thing I'd kind of bring up as well. People have to recognize that boards are there to help companies manage risk. So you absolutely need to be 100% transparent with your boards. Don't hide anything. Don't try and make it sound like you're doing the best job in the world and nothing bad is ever going to happen here. Be brutally honest and transparent with the board about the risk that you have in your environment, whether that's the fact you've been breached, they need to know about it, whether that's the fact that you're running some legacy technology that has significant vulnerabilities in it. You just got to be really honest. They're not there to mark your homework, they're there to help you manage the risk. So that sort of brutal honesty is required for a CISO, and it's not easy at times when companies have given you a lot of money and a lot of resources to get the job done, and you go in and you have to tell them that actually there's still all of these other things that you've never got to, and these other problems. It's not an easy conversation, but it is an absolutely necessary conversation, and one that CISO should never be concerned about. They should always be brutally honest.
I would agree 100% on that. I've had too many cases, or I read too many cases of, for example, the CISO does tell the CEO, hey, we have a breach right now. And then the CISO is like, we got to tell the board. And the CEO is like, no, we're not going to tell the board. And then it just like this massive PR situation then unravels like 6 months later. It's publicly known that like you didn't report to the board, and the board needs to know. They're there to advise, assist, to help you grow. Yeah, definitely on that. One things that I have heard that do happen quite a bit is sometimes when there's too many cooks in the kitchen situation. So say, for example, the CISO is talking to the executive team saying, hey, we have to work on this situation right now in our operations. But then there's other people like, oh, no, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? But they're not in security, but they're giving advice on how to go about this situation and secure that is your job. So what do you do in these type of situations? Because too many cooks in the kitchen, there's like, it continues that the stew goes bad or something. I don't know. But anyway, what advice do you have when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, when you're a CISO? Because that's going to happen at times, and it's rough, especially when you're trying to be resilient in your operations.
So I think the CISO job's changed a lot. It used to be a very kind of, most people who got into the CISO job probably 10 years ago were real technical security folk. And it was all about the technology. Now it's not at all. It's about the business, and it's about having people that understand. Again, I'll come back to the operational resilience, the operational risk piece. It's about having people that are able to converse with the business on what is their risk appetite, what is their risk tolerance, what is the narrative that goes around cybersecurity risk, such that it can be evaluated in context of the 10 other risks, strategic risks, the business leadership are dealing with. So not being outside of the conversation with the business, but equally not being outside of the conversation with the digital organization. And I use digital to encapture the CIO, the CTO, the CDO, all of those different names that you get associated with IT leadership. But that kind of, that whole digital leadership to CISO conversation has to be really robust. And the biggest skill, I think, is the notion of embedding cybersecurity. So it being a part of the solution, not separate from the solution and applied after the event, because that's where you get into that sort of clash of, actually it's good enough. I'm happy with what we've done. I'll sign off the risk. That's all too late, especially with technology delivery cycles now in days, hours and days, not in big waterfall projects that last months, if not years. You have to embed cybersecurity from through all of the development life cycle right up to release, and codify that in a way that you've agreed in your policy what is reasonable for a release to go live, but actually not leave it to a security guy who's at the end with a checklist going, no, you can't go live with that critical business project because you haven't achieved this. That's way too late in the cycle. So I think you have to embed security. And I very deliberately said the business first and digital after, because you have to do both. But actually, if you just embed it in digital, you're potentially going to miss opportunities in the business area. And I'll give you a couple of examples there. So, new country entry. So as businesses start to look at moving into new countries, you need your cybersecurity team involved in that to understand the different risks. New business entry, if you're going into new business areas, you need to understand, what are the cyber risks in those businesses, often more geopolitical type things, certainly in the country areas. Mergers, acquisitions and divestments, absolutely critical that cyber risk is evaluated in those deals. I mean, it can cost tens, if not hundreds of millions, if you get it wrong, to retrofit cyber in an organization that you've bought. And especially if you're in more of the kind of heavy engineering environment where you've got to kind of retrofit cybersecurity into operational technology. So you know, you have to be a part of everything. So the days of the deeply technical CISOs are gone, and you need people that have, you know, are able to engage at all levels in the organization in terms of the whole operational risk narrative and the operational resilience conversation. Procurement's another one, right? I mean, supply chain is absolutely critical. So getting proper contractual obligations in supply chain is hugely important. But if you're in the FTSE 100 or S&P 500, you've probably got 10,000 or plus suppliers in your procurement systems. Well, I mean, it's impossible to do anything with that number of suppliers. So how do you then rank those suppliers in a way that says these are the ones really critical to us as a business delivering our outcomes, and therefore we need to do more around ensuring their contractual obligations are in the contracts and they deliver, and we put assurance around those contractual obligations that they're actually delivering on their security obligations. So again, another example of another area of the business that you need a great conversation with. The final one I've come up with is internal audit. Internal audit are your friend. As a CISO, they are absolutely critical, and agreeing and having a good relationship with audit, and that's including them auditing you and often telling you you're not doing very well. But that's fine. You need a separate set of eyes on what you're doing. But also, as you go into different business conversations, having that audit lens saying, actually, we see these gaps. And if the CISO is saying the same thing, well, you often get more momentum behind addressing some of those maturity gaps in those areas. So often people look at audit as being somebody to avoid, but actually I would say they are absolutely your friend as a CISO, and you should work really closely, even though they'll tell you all of the time you're not doing a good enough job. But you're never going to do a good enough job.
I feel like the CISOs that tend to avoid it is because they're concerned about, you know, having like rejection sensitivity or something like that, because it's going to be like, nope, this is not good enough. Nope, that's definitely not good enough. Yeah. Simon, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is, you know, when we talk about operations resiliency, the one thing that everyone is talking about still to this day is AI security. What do CISOs need to do right now to be proactive and also reactive at this time where the adoption of AI is surging right now? It is the topic. And when it comes to operations resiliency?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, avoid the snake oil. There's an awful lot of cybersecurities. I mean, I was at Infosec, and there's an awful lot of cybersecurities out there, companies out there claiming AI is going to solve all your cybersecurity challenges. Well, it will help for sure, but you should adopt it, but don't go off buying loads of product. The worst thing I think that security organizations do is just run after more and more product to try and solve the problem. And largely because that then just becomes a massive integration headache, and you create more noise than you ever get signal when you get all of these solutions deployed out there. So, you know, how do you use AI? Well, you know, you need to figure out who the right partners are, who've got the right solutions that actually integrate into your environment, without just having this proliferation of technology. So there's absolutely no doubt AI will help from a defense perspective. But obviously at the same time, it's a bit like everything in cyber. You know, the adversaries are adopting AI at the same pace, or abusing AI at the same pace that the defensive technology can respond. So it's a bit of an arms race still, but it's always been in security, I'm afraid. When, you know, before, pre us even talking about AI, you know, we were talking about things like you know, just machine learning, etc., robotic process automation, bots, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's been out there for ages, and it's just been an arms race. I think the interesting thing with AI, from a particular interest perspective, just the ethical and moral side of things, and how do you make sure that your models aren't influenced in a way that creates a negative effect, whether that's bias or actually a genuinely negative effect. Also, you know, there's lots of there's lots of indirect relationships. So, you know, amount of people that, you know, take things like Twitter feeds and what have you. So, you know, and ingest that information as part of the decision making in their AI models. They've got to make sure that, you know, that's not being influenced by sophisticated international nation state actors, right? I mean, who knows what was true and what wasn't true around the elections and how they were influenced. But you can see the possibility of that being a way that influences some of the feeds that you take into your models that eventually end up giving you the wrong decision, and that is vexingly complicated to solve. So the question is, can you actually take the human out of the loop of all of that, or what does the human play in terms of still putting the right governance around those models that you're deploying from an AI perspective?
So
that wasn't an answer, because I don't think there is one.
I think it's kind of like one of those things that it's still developing. So we're trying to figure out what comes next. So we'll all have our own like ideas, but we won't know, I think, with time. And it's kind of that situation.
Yeah. And you know, you get the world's ending kind of narrative around AI is going to be the end of the world and all that.
Yeah.
You know,
That the whole Elon Musk situation, like we have to put a hold on AI for 6 months because the world could come to an end, but then he launches his own AI product within those 6 months. Like,
yeah, it is all a bit bizarre, but I think again, I think there's interesting in the whole cyber world. If you step back a little bit as well, you know, in the kinetic world, you've got things like the Geneva Convention about but you don't have similar in the cyber world. In the AI world, you're going to have to get some kind of ethical and moral regulations put in place and some way of governing it, because, you know, the world isn't going to end. I mean, that's, you know, it's not going to cause that, in my opinion, it's not going to cause that catastrophic effect, but it could end up creating some really divisive outcomes. You know, I do quite a lot of work with a fairly marginalized group, or very marginalized group, as a part of a not-for-profit, and I can see that, you know, if people start to use data that is misinformed in their AI models, that will just lead to more and more marginalization of already marginalized groups. And that really worries me. So from a kind of inclusion and a diversity perspective, that really does concern me.
Yeah, it's the thing, I guess, probably keeps you up at night on AI is the whole biases situation, like you said earlier, because when you don't have diverse people creating a product, you're going to get a very interesting result where it doesn't be applicable to other groups of people, and then they get, you know, pushed out in a sense. And that's something that we've seen in security in our products too.
Yeah, and I think you just add to that there's a lot of capability out there to influence the inputs to those models, because you don't actually need to change the model necessarily. You just need to influence the model through the data that's being fed to it. And you know, some of the very well resourced nation states have fairly uninclusive, extreme right-wing opinions, and that really worries me that's going to be used to influence models, and the outcome of that will just be more and more marginalization of those groups.
It sounds like you were mentioning earlier about getting like certain standards and practices that could be used. I don't know how familiar you are with ESG, like environmental, social governance. That I feel like that's kind of, it needs to be more up to date. I don't know if you've seen the ESG for cybersecurity. It's very bland. It's like very basic, but I think we need something like that around AI because we don't have these type of measurements nor transparency about how companies are using it or utilizing it when it comes to security needs.
Yeah, I agree, but I think there's still also an awful lot needed in cybersecurity as well. So I think I think the US government have become a lot more declarative lately, which is good. It sets the bar and it sets the expectations. Just I'm moved back from AI back to cyber. And I think that's really good because it tells people what they need to do. The UK government have got some great material in place, but it's less declarative. So it leaves it to companies to try and interpret what does it mean, and it's really broad. And I worry about that because there is, how do you, you're almost marking your own homework at that point because there's no bar to achieve. So I think, and the US, UK are fairly advanced in, and certainly in the European countries as well, fairly advanced in their kind of regulatory regimes. But I do think there needs to be more certainly declarative guidance in the UK about what people should be doing in the manner of cybersecurity. The CAF, the Cyber Assessment Framework, is good, but it's so broad that if you don't understand cybersecurity, you don't really know what you need to do.
Yeah, it always seems like that when it even comes to like legislation. It's whatever the US first does with cybersecurity, then like the UK tends to copy and follow like the anti-hacking laws, anti-copyright laws, like all of that. So hopefully the US will move it a little bit faster. I know that we have CISA and they're doing a phenomenal job in getting vulnerability disclosure for companies. And now it's going into the AI world. Simon, I'm going to leave you with one last question here before we wrap up this episode, and thank you for being on here. And the question I have for you is, what advice do you have for CISOs that are trying to improve their resiliences with operations, and in particular while looking at the world as we're going to new technologies utilizing AI?
So get the basics right. Well, basics is that's the wrong word. Get the fundamentals right. So don't worry about the last 5% of cybersecurity when you haven't got the first 95% addressed. So things like patching, the one of the buzzwords in the industry that really concerns me is things like zero trust. Because you can't have zero trust unless you've got a trusted identity platform. So identity is the hub of everything. And yet, people will sell you lots of technology that will notionally give you zero trust. So you've got to really get back to those fundamentals and make sure that, you've got your identity secure, you've got good patching regime in place. You've got continuous vulnerability assessment. You need to know when something crops up on the internet before the hackers see it out there and exploit it. So there's some fairly fundamental things that you just should focus on getting in place, and then because that will give you that operational resilience, backup and recovery. Crisis management, incident management and response playbooks How do you recover from a complete outage of ransomware? Or it doesn't have to be ransomware, frankly. It could be a configuration mistake in IT. But how do you respond from those things? How quickly can you respond? And therefore, what does a business need to do to manage the continuity of the business whilst you're recovering the IT environments? They all sound pretty dull, but it is absolutely critical to getting operational resilience in place. And it's only then you can sort of go to sleep at night knowing that you will get attacked, and hopefully you'll withstand it because you've got the basic controls in place. If you don't withstand it and you get impacted, you've got the ability to recover it in a time frame that's appropriate for the business to continue to deliver on their strategic outcomes.
Well, thanks, Simon. It was lovely to have you on here. I'll have to have you back on soon. Until then, everyone, stay safe, and I will catch you in the next episode. Thanks again, Simon.
Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSP Magazine with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.